60年来
China-French relations have always been at the forefront of China's relations with Western countries over the past 60 years, bringing benefits to the two peoples and contributing to world peace, stability, and development.
Beijing and Paris marking 6 decades of friendship. We look at major areas of Sino-French cooperation, how the relationship has developed, the hurdles they faced, and what lies ahead. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was the height of the Cold War, January 27, 1964, when France became the first Western nation to normalize ties with China. The bold move jump-started China's rise on the global stage. And in the decades since, Sino-French relations have strengthened and expanded. Today, France is China's third largest trading partner in the European Union, with bilateral trade totaling nearly $79 billion. Tony Waterman has more.
It took just 45 Chinese characters to change the course of history. This is the original 1964 communiqué announcing China and France were establishing formal diplomatic relations.
It came as a surprise even to French ministers. The decision was described as bold. Then President Charles de Gaulle said that it seemed abnormal to him not to maintain relations with the most populous country in the world, one of the countries destined to carry a great deal of weight.
It would take another decade before France's Western peers, like Germany, Spain, and the United States, followed suit. During that time, ties between Beijing and Paris deepened and expanded. Georges Pompidou became the first European leader to visit China in 1973. A visit returned by Deng Xiaoping just 2 years later. It was the first official visit by a Chinese leader to a major Western country. But Deng already had a deep connection to France, having lived and worked in the country as a young man.
France also had a kind of a special place in a lot of the Chinese imagination. I mean, Deng joins the Communist Party in France for the first time. So I mean, there's very direct relationship between the growth of Chinese nationalism and Chinese communism and France.
In the decades since, China has become France's third largest trading partner, topping $108 billion in 2022. The nations are also key allies on nuclear energy, aeronautics, and fighting global challenges like climate change.
These relations have had their ups and downs. There have been a few bad moments depending on the period, but in the end I think the two partners have always tried to be as pragmatic and effective as possible in finding areas of convergence and collaboration.
During President Emmanuel Macron's state visit to China last year, President Xi Jinping hailed the relationship as the world undergoes profound historical changes. That relationship goes far beyond economics and policy. Some 30,000 Chinese students study in France every year, while French students are learning Mandarin in school. France has also become a popular destination for Chinese tourists. More than 2 million visited the country before COVID. And while their return has been slower than expected, 2024 has been dedicated as the official year of French-Chinese cultural tourism. A number of artistic performances are planned in both countries throughout the year, including a concert at France's most famous palace, Versailles. Another sign of an enduring partnership that started with a surprise communiqué 60 years ago. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Paris, France.
So much to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Liang is a chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Richard Worley, an international correspondent with Swiss daily Blick. Also joining us, Joav Toker. He is an associate professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. And Victor Chow, chair professor at Soochow University. Thank you all for coming in. Looking forward to a lively 30 minutes of discussion. Victor, I want to begin with you. You could probably write a treatise on this question I'm going to ask, so I'm going to ask you to kind of keep it as limited as you can. Over the past 60 years, the two countries have really adhered to focusing on strategic choices that have been basically independent of any kind of external influences and committed to achieving the common development through mutually beneficial cooperation. Let's look at this relationship where it is today, and let's also look back where we were as a world back in January of 1964. President Kennedy had been assassinated just a couple of months earlier. The Cold War was at its height. They were just coming out of the notorious Cuban Missile Crisis as well. So how significant on a global scale was this for these two countries to be able to sit down and find a way to open up?
Thank you very much for having me. While we are today celebrating the 60th anniversary of the normalization of relations between China and France, two of the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council, if we look back 60 years ago, for these two countries really to reach out to each other and recognize each other, normalize their relations with each other, is truly extraordinary. Because at that time, China was more or less standing alone in its own capacity on the global scene, relatively very backward in many respects, while France was already highly developed and with its unique culture, with its true independence. Now, for these two countries to recognize each other and concluding that each was independent and important in its own way, and regardless of the international relations at that particular point, these two cultures, these two civilizations deserve their own place and deserve to be recognized by each other. Now, this was truly a historical conclusion, and the recognition of each other and normalization of relations between China and France really shaped the world, I would say, because it brought China to the forefront in front of all these Western countries, and for France to be the first one to take the right direction in this manner demonstrated that France, as far as China was concerned at that time, was not only independent, but also truly extraordinary, and its culture was highly admired by China, by the leaders, and by the Chinese people. Now, 60 years later, France is still in its glory, and China has completely transformed itself. I think in today's world, China-French relations are truly very, very important, especially when we face a lot of headwinds in the world. The two countries need to get closer to each other and beef up their solidarity and cooperation and friendship in many ways.
Joav, I want to pick up on that word that Victor just talked about, headwinds. We're still dealing with headwinds, and as we mentioned, of course, France, the first Western nation to recognize China, but it was also two iconic leaders at that time back in 1964, the leader of China, the leader of France as well. Talk to us about what role you believe China and France played then and play now in greater China-European relations.
You know, the overall context in Europe, in Asia, and worldwide in '64 was far away from what we're familiar with now. However, the decision in Beijing and Paris to step forward and establish relations was basically a geostrategic step, which General de Gaulle, the president of France at the time, chose to do in spite of the delicacies that such a decision might have and had introduced into the overall so-called Western morphology of the blocs and the animosity and competition. Now, throughout those 6 decades, there were all kinds of variants which characterized, but I'll jump right away to today's situation, and I would say that in spite of so many variants, today the key to understand where there's really good relations of all go forward is also mainly geostrategic. It is important, of course, to look at what is happening in terms of tourism,
sure,
and trade, and retail, and other domains. But the key for what is happening in what's going to happen in the long run is geostrategic. We have to put into that equation the situation in the war in Europe, Russia and Ukraine, the situation in the overall reblocking geography, other regional problems and bloodsheds, and these may play a more important role than specific elements which are on the direct agenda of both China and France.
Indeed. Jan, let's talk about those delicacies that Joav talks about, these two countries overcoming. And look at where they are today. This is perhaps not a gamble, but something that certainly paid off for both nations. France is now China's third largest trading partner in the EU, with some $79 billion trading last year, and China is France's top trading partner in Asia. Talk to us about how 60 years have really fostered this path for these countries to go down and continue with trade, tourism, and the things that we just discussed.
Hi, good to talk to you, Sean. So I agree with my previous colleague panelist. Yes, geostrategic interests are very important, but let's not forget, this economic ties, these economic connections really lay the foundations for mutual benefits for growing corporations and also for, gaining trust in each other. So yes, the two countries has really formed a lot of trade, finance, investment, science, technology, culture, and people-to-people exchanges. And all these ties really weather through, major geopolitical transformations, economic crises, and many, many challenges. And it really demonstrates the potential and also the resiliency going forward. So you're right, the two countries really trade in a really mutually beneficial way, because their patterns of trade, their productions are largely complementary. But that said, I think there's still great potentials. We have not seen the recovery really of the two-way trade after the pandemic. Right. And there are also sticking points in terms of France's concerns about trade imbalance with a deficit against them. They're also worried about the so-called over-reliance on China in terms of green energies and green energy equipment and so on and so forth. But I think really, for one, is yes, getting market access is important, but also, they would need to think about how to improve their own competitiveness by, for example, forming investment joint ventures with China. And also, when you think about, in terms of the so-called over-reliance on China, I think really the key here is not to disengage or decouple from China, but really to think about how to form interdependence. And again, I think the emphasis here is that win-win cooperation can bring mutual benefits, can bring mutual trust. And I think that will lay the foundation for many, many other relations as well.
Jan, you brought up a couple of buzzwords that we've heard, especially in discussions with the United States: trade balance and also decoupling. France does want better trade balance, but it is a country that's steering away from decoupling right now. And secondly, France is also viewed as a nation that can really help China with its EU relationships. Where do you see that going, and do you think that is going to play a significant role in the years moving forward?
Absolutely. First of all, I think Macron has been pragmatic. He has been talking about, the European Union should not just blindly follow the US's lead. They need to think about their own independent strategic interests. And then they also talk about they don't want to be dragged into crises that are not of their own. So I think it's very important to have that kind of pragmatism in mind. And then when you think about, imbalance, yes, there is a trade imbalance, about 4 billion euros against France. But again, like I said, you need to think about the market access issue, but also how to improve competitiveness. So for example, if you don't want to import a lot of EVs from China, then maybe you would want to welcome, Chinese joint ventures in France to produce the EVs for the French market. And because I think France, as many European countries, their top economic agenda is really to have the climate to have the green transition. So I think, if they're able to partner with China, they can greatly increase the production capacity for EVs, for example, right? France has this ambitious goal, by 2030, they wanted to produce about 2 million EVs domestically, and really trying to, phase out the ICEs by 2035. So I think really partnering with China is really the key to both achieve the climate goals, but also to foster kind of win-win cooperation and also have that kind of interdependence.
Richard, firstly, thank you for your patience. Sorry it took so long to get to you, but we've talked about the history and we've talked about trade. Let's talk about where we are now as you know, within the world and the face of increasingly prominent global security. Where you think that China and France can work together, areas that their common goals can really go a long way in influencing where the globe goes as a whole?
Well, I believe France's interest is to have a very good diplomatic relation with China, not only because it will clearly benefit its trade, but also in different regions of the world, the two countries share kind of same goals. One problematic region, I may say, is Africa, because in Africa, China is seen as overtaking France and taking the place that France was occupying before. And that may be a bit contentious. But in other regions of the world, I think France look at China as a peacemaker. And if we look at the Middle East now, I have heard several times recently French diplomats saying the only country that is really looking for peace in the Middle East is China. So I really believe there is an interest from the French side as seeing China more offensive when it comes to defend multilateral institutions, the United Nations, and peace and stability. Now, let's face it, there are problems, and the problem comes from the fact that France is an Indo-Pacific nation with territory like Polynesia or New Caledonia off the Australian coast. And in that regard, there is a competition between France and China. I was 2 years ago in New Caledonia, and I can tell you that there, the French army officers look at China as a rival and potentially as an adversary, maybe as a future enemy. So this is the situation as we see it. On the one end, there is a big willingness from France to have diplomatic relation, I would say diplomatic cooperation with China on different issues. But on the other hand, let's face it, when it comes to Asia, where France has some interest, both countries have diverging interest.
Victor, let's talk more about security and the role that these two countries, especially China, could play. Ukraine fighting is still going on. We know that the fighting between Israel and Gaza is threatening to blow up and spread throughout the whole region. How critical is it right now for France and China to move together, and especially taking into consideration what we've heard, that France and so many other countries look to China right now as perhaps the only nation out there saying, look, we need dialogue. We need to find a way to stop this.
These questions are crucially important in the world of today. I think while China-France relations are close and each respecting each other, it is very natural that these two great nations would have some differences. But I think there is only one megatrend that will characterize China-French relations. That is peace and negotiation with each other to solve whatever differences there are between the two countries. War or rivalry or confrontation between China and France will be a dead end to start with. Never try that. And even if you think about it, it may poison the relations between the two countries. In the world of today, war and peace will be the two major choices for many countries, many regions in the world. Therefore, for China and France to get closer to each other, to really admire each other, respect each other, and to be committed to use peace and negotiation and diplomacy to solve whatever problems there are between these two great nations, and to refuse to be hijacked by other countries' geopolitical worries, for example, and try to always retain their independence and autonomy in looking at each other, in dealing with the bilateral relations, will be truly important geopolitical choices for China and France, and for China and the Western world at large.
You know, Joav, we've talked about how the United States and China are working through their tensions, but Macron has also made it clear that France wants its own seat at the table, that it considers itself, if you will, the third prong in terms of economic and political power. Listen to what French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire had to say.
We are strong and reliable allies of the United States of America, and we intend to remain strong and reliable allies of the United States of America. We need to be more independent. This has been at the core of the European policy. This will be at the core of the French policy. We want to be sovereign. We want to be independent. We want to engage China. Because we strongly believe that the best way of getting some concrete results from the relationship of China is to engage China.
Joav, I'd like to get you to expand on that and get your thoughts on that.
Well, this is a pragmatic, common sense approach, which indeed is rooted in concrete policies of this French government and previous ones. What should be important perhaps to contextualize in this respect is the overall bloc situation as it is right now. France is part of the so-called West. France is one of the 2 or 3 leading nations of the EU, which per se is an ally of the United States. I don't know what the situation would be in this context comes November with the elections coming up in America, but right now that's the situation. So the French president and the French administration are operating in this framework. Now, within this overall frame, yes, when the Minister of the Economy says that he wishes to engage China, that's a constructive and common sense ambition to have, and indeed, this is what the French do. But once again, one has to look at the points of tension and the regions of friction, which are numerous, in which some of them are next door to China, such as Taiwan. Some of them is next door to France and Europe, such as Ukraine and Russia. And some is just off behind the corner in the Middle East. So this overall organization of the map of the world in terms of alliances and diplomatic and perhaps military energies will decide for the step in the future to be taken.
Victor, real quickly, I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Well, indeed, I think China and France are really having probably the most normal relations between 2 great countries, if you look at China's relations with the rest of the Western world. And this should be a good example of how China and other major Western nations need to handle their relations. No one should claim that they are the allies of the United States, therefore they should be subjugated to the dominance of the United States. From the Chinese perspective, all countries are equal to each other, and all Western countries should hold themselves out as an equal rather than as a subjugate of another major Western country. France has set a good example for all the Western countries in keeping its independence, in dealing with China, engaging with China for mutual benefit and for greater peace in the world.
Liang, we've talked, especially recently, about the sensitivities with the economy in China right now. 60 years, you can foster a lot of ties, and that goes a long way toward working out any kind of differences with any kind of nation. But President Xi has made it clear he would like to see more foreign investment within China, and hopes that France is going to provide a fair business for Chinese environments. Your thoughts on that and how critical it's going to be for these countries to work together moving forward, especially with the EU right in the background?
Right, that's a great question. I think that investment cooperation has been very important, and it has been, having a lot of potentials. So the 2 countries have already formed joint ventures in EVs, in battery productions, in aerospace, and in many other areas as well. And I think these kinds of investments are really benefiting both countries. So France's investment in China, for example, and also in the infrastructure, for example, high-speed rail, and also, nuclear energies, and also metro systems. And all of these are super helpful for China to acquire certain technologies, the capital, the expertise, and to grow those sectors. And same with China's investment in France, in nuclear, in solar power, and in many other, areas. So a lot of these investments really are helping each other's economy. And not to mention, I also wanted to mention, the previous panelists' argument about, China and France's competition, so to speak, in Africa. But let's not forget, first of all, I think, it's not a matter of having who has the more power or dominance or influences in Africa. I think really the African countries should take the agency and decide who they wanted to partner with. And the two countries actually have formed many joint projects, 7 projects worth $1.7 billion since 2022 in African countries, including, for example, the solar power and wind power projects in South Africa. So I think these kinds of corporations can be win-win, can be complementary, and they not need to be destructive competition between the two.
Wonderful. Richard, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to pick up on what Jan was just talking about, the solar power, the wind power, and the fact that China and France have worked together so closely on climate issues, especially looking back to the Paris Accord back in 2015, how important that is. We only have about 45 seconds left. Give me your best take on that.
Well, certainly from France, China is seen as an ally, is seen as a very reliable ally in terms of fighting climate change. And I think there is trust between the two countries. Now the big question is technology. At the moment, China is ahead. And to tell you the truth, a lot of French industrial would like to get in the competition and maybe to be stronger in the market. So yes, cooperation in fighting climate change, but never forget industrial competition.
Wonderful. Really want to thank everybody. 60 years running, China and France. It's been a wonderful discussion. As always, thanks to our panelists. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs here in Washington, D.C. And as always, thanks for watching.